أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. I was not scheduled to give a talk today, but in one of these leadership courses I went to, they asked everybody, how would you describe yourself as? And so they had all kinds of things like a wolf and an owl and this and that, and people described themselves according to what they would like to be or like to be known as. So they asked me, what do you think, how do you describe yourself? So I said, I like to think of myself as a spare tire. Nice to have, but not to be used as often. So that's unfortunately the role we have, but today unfortunately we need the spare tire, so here I am, inshallah. So this is at very short notice, and we need to make sure that it's not the final, because there are lots of things on these subjects which are needed. Fortunately here we are divided between young people and pensioners, so there is obviously conflict of interest. Yeah, some will be paying the pensions of the others, and they might not like to do that for long. So we have to be careful. So what we have in terms of the presentation is what are pensions about, the question of longevity, which means increasing life expectancy, demographics, in terms of how the age of populations is changing and what impact does it have. Then the more important question which has come up last 10 years is investment returns, and you will see why it is important. And then the kind of pensions which you could have. So these are defined benefits, defined contributions, and then of course state pensions and self-funded pensions. And then to make it more complicated, you have old age care costs, which are not quite pensions, but they need to be added up to make sense of how you will think of life. Yeah. And I think sooner we start thinking about all this, the better prepared we will be. Of course, Allah decides His own, but He has given us brains to think about it. Yeah? So you don't need to suffer unnecessarily. So pension, obviously, we have seen is used to mean a provision for retirement or old age or whatever you call it. The question is, what would you say is a retirement age? Is it 55, 60, 65, 70, and on? So most of you will know that last 10 years, for example, Greece has been in a financial crisis. One of the reasons for this crisis was that Greeks used to retire at 55. So if you want to retire at 55 and live for another 30 years, somewhere you have to pay for it. Here, until recently, women were entitled to retire at 60 and men at 65, even for state pension. Anybody born after, I think, 53 or 54, 1954, women now retire at 67, no more 60s, so you have to work for 7 years more. By the time some of you come to retirement, it might be 75. So we don't know. But, I mean, we will see why this has changed, why this has increased, and it has to increase. And then obviously, pensions is a mixture of state and private provision. So everybody is entitled to a state pension, provided you have made enough contributions. And then private pension-wise, you can have arrangements from your employer or your own, and so on, and it depends on how you manage that. From the employer, one of the more common term used is an occupational pension scheme, which means your employer. Now, there are tax advantages for the employer. So if you make a contribution and the employer makes a similar contribution or more, you get tax benefits and the employer gets tax benefits. So there is some incentivization for employers to make good arrangements for pensions. But all that, as you can realize, if you are making contributions, say from the age of 24, 25, when you start working, hopefully, these days people don't start that soon, then by the time you retire, even at this today's criteria, about 65, you're looking at 40 years of investment of that money. Now, if you understand compound interest, a 2 to 3% return compounded over 40 years and a 6% return compounded over 40 years is hugely different. So investment returns are very critical as to what you can make or what you can expect at the end. If investment returns fall, then you have a problem. And we will come to that to see what is the particular implication of this is today. Okay, now your longevity. So, life expectancy. What is the life expectancy in this country? 85. For women. For men? You tend to kill your men earlier, yeah? So 81. No, it's less. Always 3 to 4 years less. So even say 80, 84, right? And what was it 40 years ago? Okay. So say 70 max. So we have added 10 years to life expectancy in the last 30, 40 years, right? Which means 3 or 4 years every year. 1 year, every 4 years, right? Of life expectancy. Why would life expectancy increase? Better healthcare, better diet, better whatever, right? Education, so on and so forth. Fewer accidents, fewer diseases. You know, like basic diseases from immunization and so on, then healthcare and so on. So deaths in young age are less and less common, and all those things add up to give you. Just to compare, if you are saying life expectancy here is 80 years, what do you think it is in India? 60 with great difficulty. So it's 56, 60. A full 20 years less than here, right? In that kind of category, some countries have done very well. So what is the life expectancy in Iran? 74.5, getting to 75. So in that category of income groups, it's much, much better than you would expect. This is because they have better health care, better access to clean water and all those things. In places like India, 75% don't have access to a toilet. So if you just think through the implications of that, you can see how many diseases and all kinds of other things can pass through that kind of society, all right? So anyway, we are looking at here, so we are now looking at 80 to 84 years, life expectancy. And what is the retirement age? That is for state, right? Private schemes, still between 55 and 65. Nothing goes more than that. You can work after that, but you can retire between 55 and 65. So doctors can retire at what age? 60 now, yeah? So they can retire at 60. So if you're retiring at the same age as you were 10 years ago, but you're going to live 10 years longer, then what is the problem? How can we pay for it? Because it's 10-year additional payment to be made, right? So either you start to retire later, which means you are working and not drawing a pension, or you take a lower pension. This is before we come to other complications, right? Simple. It's very simple. You're living longer. At the same time, if you're living longer, there is greater chance that you will have diseases of older age, which are more expensive to treat as well, right? So the cost of maintaining you is even greater than you would otherwise. If you pack up at 60, those things are not there. And so that's the quality of life. Now, if you look at OECD countries, including the United Kingdom, you see universally there is a decline in the birth rate. So you know that you need 2.2 children per family to replicate that population, to keep the population steady. If you have more than that, then the population increases. If you have less, the population comes down. What is birth rate here, average? 1.7. 1.7. So we are already in trouble. Europe is slightly worse. Germany is the worst. And so on, right? So Europe as a whole is deficit in terms of replication. UK is a deficit now, to 1.7. So at the moment, 4 working people are supporting 1 pensioner in terms of funding the state pension, right? If nothing is done Europe-wide, then 2 working people will need to support 1 pensioner. What does that mean for working people? Huh? More tax, huh? Not working hard, more tax. Double the tax. Is that sustainable? So either they say, we're not funding you, die if you want to die from hunger and whatever. They are not simple choices coming on. They are tough choices. Because the demographics just doesn't allow a solution. And then obviously at the same time, we have an increase in expectations in terms of what, say for example, the NHS should provide you. Should it provide you plastic surgery? Say, my nose is not the right shape, I want to do that, which costs you £20,000 on the NHS. Should we do that or say, look, this is nothing really life-threatening? But how do you ration those things? As new techniques come, new inventions come, new possibilities come, people expect that. And unfortunately, the way things are, people who are more articulate, more educated, more well-off can demand more. And so resources for the basic things for others can be left behind? This is a question for separate discussion some other time, okay? And on top, with the financial crisis, you have austerity and resource crunch. So even what you have, you cannot fund. And you can see how public services are being closed down systematically, slowly. So your library has closed, and your pool will close, your assembly hall will close, then this will close, that will close. All this makes a difference to the quality of life and the expense you have to fund these things. School playgrounds are being cut off for housing development. Hospitals are being chopped off, and you see the Central Middlesex Hospital, for example, half of it is chopped off into housing development, right? And so on. So this is the problem. Sorry, I changed it by mistake. So that's the demographics. If you want to see an acute case of these demographics, you go to Japan. The birth rate is probably below 1, and the life expectancy is high. It's an aging population, and Brother Ali was telling me probably 60% is over 60. So how is this society going to work to fund itself, its care, and so on? We are getting there. We are not far.
Bring refugees.
Huh? Bring refugees? Then you have other problems, right? You have new generation, but if you look at, for example, the debate around allowing Turkey to join the European Union, right? Apart from everything else, they said there are 25 million Muslims in the existing EU. If you bring 80 from Turkey, that becomes 105. The total EU population then will be 500, which means 1 in 5 will be a Muslim. They said, no, this is not acceptable. It's a question of life and death. It is not something, it's not a choice. Sooner or later, you have to take that choice. But you see the political implications. This poor lady admitted only 1 million, Angela Merkel, and she's lost the election, she's lost everything, she's struggling to stay in power, because that is the main objection to her. There's nothing else. That you brought 1 million educated Syrians who in 5 years would be quite productive once they master the language and so on. Who is going to give you ready-made engineers, doctors, this, that? But it is not how people think. So there are political problems. If this demographics is to keep, we have to import 40 million people into the EU over the next 30 years, which means 1 million a year. Politically, it's not going to be easy, okay? All right, so we come to investment returns. Historically, these have been high. So, if you look at investments for pensions, especially, or long-term work, pension funds especially invest their monies in a number of asset classes, from shares to bonds to cash, of course, and then other kind of alternative investments and so on. The bulk of the money is always invested in bonds. So bond returns, long-term bond returns, are critical to how much pension you can make. What is the long-term gilt-edge return today? 2 is high, yeah? And what is the inflation? Okay, what is the inflation rate? So you're 1.5% worse off every year. Okay? So you can see the challenge of growing anything at these rates. There used to be a couple of percentage point positive rate of return. So if the return was 6 or 7, inflation was 3 or 4, that's something where you can work. In this situation, it's difficult. Well, if not impossible. Unless you take silly risks, yeah? Obviously, if you put all your money in Bitcoin and it doubles, you're happy. When it halves again, you're crying. So that kind of risk you cannot take with pension money. You can take with 5% of your money, but not 95% of your money. This is the problem. So after this global financial crisis, bond returns have been nearly negative. And this, of course, leads to pension deficits. So, for example, if I have already promised you that I will pay you so much pension, and then if you start living longer, then where do I get that money from? I'm short. And then if I start making less than I expected on the money I invest, I'm short again. So I can pretend, because one of the good things about pensions is that I don't have to pay everybody now. People retire at different age through. So I can pretend everything's all right, I can pay whatever, whoever is retiring, and the deficit becomes bigger. And you have a persistent underfunding. So you get this, sometimes we have seen recently, for example, you saw what happened to the BHS case, yeah? BHS, this man, well, I don't know whether we can still call him Sir, but Sir Philip Green, he sold it for £1 to somebody, the whole company, which had a pension deficit of £470 million, which means BHS, people who are working for BHS, suddenly found that their pension is gone. They worked their whole life, they have been contributing, company has been supposed to be contributing, leaving a black hole, and then selling it off. The new owner said, I don't know anything about it, I didn't buy this. After all the fuss and things, he put in £350 million of his own money to keep his knighthood, because they threatened to take his knighthood away. But anyway, you can see the other problem, other company which you want to see is Tata Steel, for example, which bought British Steel, pension deficit of 10 billion. So where are we going to fund it from? Or the recent collapse of Carl Leon, pension deficit of 400 million plus, and more companies are coming on stream which have pension deficit. The biggest pension deficit at the moment is the USS scheme, which is university staff. Deficit of, Khadija? 15 billion. Yeah. We'll come into that, yes. So it's a 15 billion deficit. And on top, there is no way you can see future returns which can help you fill this. You see, if you think that this is a temporary downturn in returns, then tomorrow there will be better times, then you see, okay, we'll make it up. Yeah? But at the moment, you're just shutting yourself off, saying that it's not going to happen. But it is going to happen, it is coming. You have a problem. So let's see how these deficits arise. Yeah? There is one kind of scheme which is called defined benefits. These were common in big companies, government institutions, civil service, universities, NHS, and so on. This is a scheme typically where both, of course, the employer and the employee contributes. Typically 6%, I think, for the employees and 12 or 10 for the employer. Benefits from this scheme are not related to the investment's return. They're saying that we will give you 1/80 typically for every year you contribute. So if you work for 40 years, you will get half, 50% of your final salary. And typically, obviously, your final salary is your highest salary. So doctors and so on who retire at, say, 60, whatever it is, and they are on, say, 100,000, 120,000, they get a pension of 60,000 a year. Inflation-proofed forever after that. This is defined benefit. So somebody has to fund it, right? If the investment return drops, who funds it? If you start living longer, same problem. Because you have to fund it for more years.
That figure is not God-given, that rate.
Which rate?
1/8.
It's most common.
Common, but government can't change it?
No. You see, this is why there is a strike at the moment in universities, right? If you go to any university now, they will not allow you to go in. There are pickets outside. Yesterday we were at SOAS. We had a seminar and they wouldn't allow us to go in. I said, what are you talking about, man? We are not teaching or learning. People have come from all over the world. You can't disrupt this. I'm a teacher myself. I'm suffering like you, so please. With great difficulty they allowed. But I will show you why they are saying this. No, you can't change suddenly something which you started. Now I can't come and say now it is one so and so. I can say for new people entering or so on, which is happening. But the problem is so big that they have to do what exactly you are suggesting. If I come to you at 65 and say, brother, I'm very sorry, we said that you will get 50,000 a year, but now we can only give you 20,000. What are you going to say to me? You're not going to be a happy person, are you?
Therefore, it would be a drag for the newcomers to this.
But that's too slow. The problem is so big, that's too slow to solve it, right? Now, especially if you, that age group is also 60% as in Japan, they'll vote you out of business if you say that. So politically, you can't change it as well. So typical retirement at the moment is 50% of final salary. That was the old scheme. The first change they did, try to do, is to convert it from final salary to career average. So your career average salary would be maybe 60% of final salary, 70% of final salary, depending how fast you have progressed, right? Career average means the whole of your working life, and then the average salary in that, which means there is a drop. Instead of 50%, you're getting 40, 30, yeah? That's the first change. Again, but still, that is guaranteed in the sense that you don't have to worry about what happens to the investments. It's still guaranteed, right? So they have tried to push career average to existing people. And sometimes, like the university pension scheme, teachers' pension scheme, they've said, any new earnings, any increased earnings you have from now on will be on career average rather than final salary. So they are trying to cut back as much as possible. The problem is big. The other way, which is getting more common, is what we call defined contributions, which means you make a contribution, your employer makes a contribution, it is invested. Whatever it comes to when you retire, they give it to you. If it comes more, fine. If it comes nothing, fine. So the investment risk is now on you. You are not going to get half your salary or whatever. You will get whatever becomes of that. So the pension amount is not guaranteed, and this is because people want to get out of the investment of the guarantee, right? And more schemes are moving there. They are closing the defined benefit and going to defined contributions. But it's a time bomb. When you come to retire, you find that it's not enough to live on. You're not going to be a very happy person, especially if you are voting as well. Okay? So, in state pension. So, state pension is about 7,000 to 8,000 pounds a year per person, max. Before, it used to be a funded scheme, which means they used to keep aside your contributions and build on it, right? Since Mrs. Thatcher came, they thought they were very clever. So they spent all the money which was in the funded scheme. That's where the money came from. And they said, from now on, we will pay the pension from the contributions of the working population. Okay? Now, as I said, if the number of children is going down and number of old age people is going up, then this equation doesn't add up. Somebody has to pay. And now this is why there is a problem on the state pension. But because pensioners are forming such a big proportion of the voting population, the Conservative government last time promised what is called a triple lock. They said your pension will go up by the inflation rate or retail price index or so and so, whichever is the highest. So you please vote for us. Okay? And the only way they have started to react to it is to try to increase the retirement age. Unfortunately, this has hit women very hard. They go from 60 to 67 straight. Before, there was a consideration that because women spend time in bringing up children and so on, they should retire earlier. We should bear that cost as a society. Now suddenly jumping to 67. And there is a big movement from women to get some kind of tapering on that. I don't think it will going to happen because austerity is quite problematic. So you can see that even the state pension is not going to be affordable at this rate and with these demographics which we have in this country. And now there is a new question. With the increase in what we call self-employment and the gig economy, people working for things like Uber and this and that, they have no company pension. So they have to make their own arrangement. Again, they have a bigger problem. It's not only similar to defined contributions, what you put in and how much it grows. You have to be disciplined. If I tell a 25-year-old that you have to put, Riaz, how much you are saying? 15% of your salary into pensions, they send me away. They say, you're stupid. Let me spend it, right? But if you don't, and you come to 65, or whatever age you want to retire, you'll have nothing there, apart from the state pension. So how to convince this person that it is necessary to put aside whatever, 5, 10, 20% of your income for retirement? So what will happen then? before you were working, so by force you were being putting, yeah, as a teacher, as a doctor, as whatever, and in the companies as well. But now, the company don't want to put it, because obviously there is a cost to the company as well. And how do I persuade you to put it? Okay, few people may be lucky, they put aside and they buy a property or they buy some assets and then they have it at retirement. But that is not a general proposition. This is a proposition for few people. And the proportion of income needed for decent retirement, although Riyadh says 15%, I think 15 is not bad. Because in this case, the employer doesn't put anything. In the university case, for example, if I put 6%, my university puts 12%. So it becomes 18. But if they were not there, I would have to put 18 to get the same equivalent benefit, right? Or they could put less. I mean, so it's around 10-15%, which you need even before we look at the other problems of investment return and all those other things. So whilst you may think that you are working for a top company, pension-wise, you're being hit badly. There are other problems, of course, you have seen, like sick pay and this and leave and so on, which you can't get when you're working for Uber. And so there are cases, of course, going on to make them accountable for these things. But that's a separate question. But more and more people are working for this kind of things, or self-employed, or working from home, or contracting, or doing whatever. Which brings these questions. They have to think of these themselves. They don't have a ready-made scheme to look at it. And on top of that now, you add old age care. Longevity, of course, which is living longer, which most of us may think is desirable. But then you have the question of affordability, because the question is quality of life. How long will you have your own abilities, mobility, brain power, whatever it is, to live properly. If you can't, then you need care. And then there is a cost to it. That is not part of the pension calculation at all at the moment, right? And it is not part of the NHS calculation as well. They can't afford it. So if as you number of old people grows, then obviously it's completely unaffordable in that sense, right? So the question is what to do now. There are, of course, a number of solutions for different societies. All of them have trade-offs, pluses and minuses, right? As we have seen, immigration is not a viable solution because of political problems. But can you find somebody to pay your pension if you invest in them? If you invest in younger populations, countries with younger population properly, those investment returns can fund your retirement, right? By investment, I mean proper investment. So, for example, instead of bringing all Turks to settle in the UK or Europe, you invest massively in Turkey. You get dividends if you pay your pensions. You invest massively in the Mediterranean, southern Mediterranean countries when you do that. That is part of the rationale for the EU, that if you invest in the less well-off EU countries, eventually they will pay. That those investments will pay back, right? So for example, if you see already, very few people from Ireland are coming here. 20, 30 years ago, all the builders were Irish. Today, all the builders are Polish or East European. If Poland and East Europe become the same standard of living as Ireland, they won't come here. But for us, they will be quite beneficial because there will be markets for our goods. There will be places where we can invest and make returns which are decent instead of 1 or 2% bond returns. And we can square this circle. So there are political decisions, short of immigration, which can be taken. It needs long-term focus and application and thinking. And at the moment, if you start doing that, let's say, look, our NHS is not funded and you are investing in Morocco and Algeria and so on. How do you explain to these people that, look, if you don't do that, however much you fund here, you will die off? Because the demographics don't add up. So I think it is in Sweden, they had this demographic question as well. Of course, much more acute than here, because the birth rate is even lower. And they said, we will pay the full salary for 2 years for any woman who has a child, trying to see if the birth rate will increase. It's hardly made a difference. The way of life is such that people just do not want to bring up more than 1 or 2 children. It's not easy. And they are not valued. As you see, if you now increase the retirement age from 60 to 67, you see that there is really no value to this contribution to society. So, if you understand the economic case, and you understand why pensions are in a crisis, and if you see, for example, everything moving away from defined benefits, only sitting on a time bomb. Many, many people will retire without enough to be able to live on. But then that's a burden on society again, right? And choices, difficult choices, have to be made. Assalamu alaikum.
How has this been tackled in China?
The brother is asking, how are these things tackled in China or India? There is no pension, apart from small parts of the civil service, very, very basic pensions. Again, deficits funded by the state. But China has made a big mistake, and now it's going to have to pay for it. For 20 years, China started a one-child policy per family. So if you look at its demographics, it's becoming very skewed. And in terms of going forward, it's going to have problems. It has relaxed its one-child family now. I think you can have 2 or 3, maybe. But that 10, 15 years of one child is going to create a big bump in their problems. These are not countries which are as wealthy as we are, right? We are the 5th wealthiest country in the world. So they have a problem. There are many other problems before pensions. And as I said, life expectancy is hardly 60. So that solves half the problem, right?
Khadija?
Thank you. I have 2 questions. One is, what's the role of new technology like robotics technology, and how can we ensure, if it is some form of solution, especially to things like old age care, how can we ensure that the owners of technology aren't the ones that benefit, and the rest of us just get made redundant, for example. And my second question is, what would a Labour government under Jeremy Corbyn do that would be different?
So there are three questions actually. One is the whole question of technology and robotics, right? And in terms of gains from deployment of technology and robotics, more than the fact of technology and robotics itself. As you can see, at the moment, there is still monopolization of these profits, right? So some of the biggest companies like your Google or Facebook or Apple or whatever, they're enormously wealthy. They're wealthy on our data. You see, for example, Facebook, you are providing them the data. So if you started to sell it, then you can see the tables turning. In fact, there is a discussion already that these guys should pay a universal pension to everybody from their profits, right? It's a serious discussion. I'm not talking about in the sort of blogs and things. I'm looking at Financial Times and things. They are discussing these things. In fact, yesterday the government has announced a new approach to taxing them according to the turnover they have in different countries rather than the profits they declare, yeah, because they could manipulate profits. But it's saying if 40% of your turnover comes from the UK, 40% tax should be paid here on that, and so on. So anyway, that discussion will go further. How to I don't think it will be totally eliminated, but it's very similar to what we had in the United States and then otherwise other countries called antitrust legislation, where big groups were forcibly downsized and broken up in order to create more, if you like, percolation of their wealth down. Yeah? Well, that will take time. Robotics itself may allow a number of, may make a large number of jobs redundant. So that might lead to more discussion about universal basic incomes and so on, just to make sure that people have spending power. Because if you make more and more people redundant, apart from the social consequences, your own products will not sell, right? So in order to sell them, you have to pay people to buy them. Just like, for example, to sell to the United States, China has to lend money to the United States so that they could buy their goods. If they stop lending, that chain stops. But robotics also has the potential of making old age easier. And I remember we had a discussion a long time ago that some of the things which the Japanese have come up with, because to cope with this old age, are quite possible to be imported here and deployed to make life more from the experience they have had. Yeah. And it might also be positive in that sense, right? But how far it goes, and of course this brings us to this whole question of trademarks or patent rights. Now, there is a professor at Sussex University who has done a beautiful work on Apple. Professor Mariana Mazzucato argues that most of Apple's profits should accrue to society, because everything in Apple technology owes its origin to the space program. Like, for example, miniaturization and so on, yeah? So if everything, all your research was funded by the state, then a major part of your profits should go back to the state, not to the shareholders of Apple. And this kind of thinking is going to come more and more common. But before that, I'm afraid populism may take over and create headaches. And so I'm not very optimistic as to what can happen. Corbyn, of course, is caught in the middle. They can do a number of things. They could reverse. You see, if you look at the what's been done post-war here, the difference between Labour governments and Conservative governments, you see that they could make a difference on the margin of about 10 to 20%. For example, during the last Labour rule, a lot of the deficit in the NHS was made up, and you get better hospitals and better this and that. In the last 10 years, all of that has been left to decline because there's no real term increase in NHS funding. So if they come, they might be able to do that. But given the political cycle, it's not a lasting solution until they change the mindset, right? Some of the things which are happening are helping them, like Carleon, like this more than silly episode of the East Coast Railway. You know the East Coast Railway, which is running from King's Cross to Edinburgh, was run by a private company before, after John Major's reforms. It was loss-making, so it was taken over and run by the state. When Mr. Osborne came, that state-run company was making a decent profit. So he said, that's not good, we have to privatize this. So they privatized it to Virgin and Stagecoach. Because Virgin and Stagecoach presented figures to Mr. Osborne which were fancy in terms of traffic numbers and so on. But the contract they negotiated was that we will pay you £3.2 billion in profits, as share of profits, but we have an option to opt out after 2 years without paying anything. It's a 5-year contract, okay? So for 2 years they enjoyed themselves, and then they said last month, 2 months ago, they said, sorry, thank you very much, we can't make it run. The numbers were wrong, and we don't pay you anything. Those guys were making a profit before, the state. Now for a conservative government to admit that a state-run enterprise is doing better than private enterprise, this is difficult. I mean, this is Grayling, who is the manager, who is the minister, who said, I cannot give Southern Railways to TfL because it's led by a Labour mayor. That's his mindset. So now here, he's stuck, right? But it creates an atmosphere for people like Corbyn to come up with a proper solution and say, we're going to take all the railways in, full stop. Or we're going to renegotiate these contracts and make sure that you can't get out without penalty. Because now what is going to happen, for the next 3 years, Virgin has asked for what is called a cost-plus contract. You know what is a cost-plus contract? You come to them and you say, this is my cost, and I need 10% on top. Who is going to decide what is your cost? This is like a license to print money. The West Coast, they have taken on the same basis, and they want to take the East Coast on the same basis. And it's disastrous in terms of public funding. But as people become aware, they're going to be more inclined towards Corbyn-type solutions, right? When he came, they said, this guy is a communist. Now they're saying he is left of center. Now they're afraid of him coming. You see, the press has started that he is a communist spy. Now this is scaremongering because now they understand that the public may be ready for some kind of changes which are serious. right? You can't pretend ideologically that this is better. You have to see what works and what doesn't work. There are chances, but then his team is not as strong as we think, right? It's not so easy to operate these and these gangsters of the right, media and all, right? It's not easy.
Razak?
Is the reason why we are in such a mess because of historical mistakes?
Like,
So, for example, in the past, returns were very high when most of us were contributing, we to the NHS, we to the in socials or privately, and it is so. Firstly, taxes went down, so revenue for the government came down, or in companies, it was the bosses who took large dividends or salaries or bonuses to take the money out of the companies, so the companies don't have the money to pay for the pensions. So surely all of this has contributed to the situation we're at now.
so what you're saying is that taxes shouldn't have gone down?
Well, so we are reaping the benefits of the tax going down.
Okay, so there are two things about taxes we need to understand, right? One is that when they go down, they're difficult to put back up, right? Politically. Sometimes, if there is only going up, then there is inefficiency creeping in. We say, well, we just fund it by more tax. So it becomes a question of diminishing returns. You have to be careful. So there's a balance there. But if you ideologically say that taxes must go down, then you are stuck there and you can't do anything. Now, at the moment, for example, all this austerity is because we are saying we can't increase taxes. We have trouble, we can't increase taxes. We can increase and then bring them down again. So there are historical mistakes there, which need to be, but then it is a question of politics. If you are standing, and I'm standing for election, I'm saying I'm going to cut your tax, and you're saying I'm going to increase, who's going to win? That's what happened. So, and the problem is that now, after the last 30 years, the nature of wealth has changed. A lot of the wealth is in real estate, people's wealth. So now if you're going to come and tell me I'm going to tax your house, which is not taxed at the moment, the one which you live in, am I going to vote for you? Difficult choices. So if you convince people of our generation that we have to pay more tax on our inherited wealth or on our accumulated wealth, then it can work. But then you have to be quite convinced that this is used and spent in the right things, yeah, not in subsidizing Mr. Branson for the East Coast Railway. Huh?
Is a pension related to interest rate?
No, the growth in pension is, because the higher the interest rate, the better the bond return. So the affordability of pension is related to the return. No, it's low, but exactly. And so the problem is compounded. You see, you have demographic change, you have decline in returns, and you have all kinds of other things which make it really, really, really complex. Sorry? You can't afford the triple lock, so if you allow it to decline and it grows less than inflation, then in 20 years it's as good as nothing.
Thank you very much, Iqbal. I think we'll end there. Salwat. I'm sure Iqbal Uncle's around for a little while, so if you've got any further questions.